You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Daphne Zohar, and my co hosts today are Bruce Booth, Eric Schmidt, Yaron Werber, Brian Skorney, and Sam Fazeli. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. So, after years of underperformance, biotech has been rallying, and it looks like it may be more sustainable this time. We've had some solid fundamentals, strong clinical data, fewer weak players, renewed M&A activity, and importantly, successful commercial launches by biotechs. The number of companies trading below their cash value has dropped from greater than 200 3 years ago to about 50 now, according to Stifel. And layoffs across biotech in 2025 have already exceeded last year's total, which to some extent, I mean, it's sad, but it also shows discipline and a culling of weak programs. Biotech M&A is on track for its strongest year since 2019, and concerns about policy seem to be settling down a bit. The IPO market seems to still be pretty much closed. But Yaron, you mentioned you're seeing more generalist interest. You're on mute.
There we go. Hopefully
There
you
you
can hear me.
go.
So we've been marketing a lot, and Eric and Brian and so everybody chit chat chime in, and especially we were in Europe last week and we did a lot of events this week, and the generalist interest is definitely much more palpable, and it's back. And now we do need to maybe be very specific that specifically in Europe, as you know, Argenix has been added to the Euro 50 at a 1% weighting, which is actually fairly sizable. So we got investors coming in to meetings because they wanted to talk about Argenix, and that inevitably flows into things like an Ionis or a general sort of sector discussion. And in some cases, people came in to see biotech analysts because they were obviously planning on investing more in pharma. But even in the US, we're beginning to see small cap generalists kind of dabbling in very specific names. And we are, in our conferences, have been seeing some generalists that, friends we haven't seen in a while coming up to us, giving a hug and saying, it's time to kind of at least close my short in healthcare. So that's a compliment, and we'll take it.
That's funny. So, what kinds of companies are drawing attention at this point?
Well, in large cap, people are looking at more kind of growthy names. So I would say like an Argenix, UCB, that one of my colleagues, Stacy Koo, covers very well. People have been looking at Alnylam, specifically in our coverage universe, also smaller Ionis, that's a little bit more diversified commercial company. So that's kind of what we're seeing, and I'd love to see what everybody else is saying.
Yeah, I'd love to go to Bruce. We were having a fun conversation earlier this week about predictions for the XBI. I think it was at about 112 today. Do you think this rally is sustainable, and what are your thoughts on the IPO market?
Yeah, Daphne, I think you summed it up well. There's a lot of tailwinds behind us right now, and I think after multiple years of retrenchment, it's ready for the cycle to turn. And I think as generalists come back, I think that's going to be a real momentum builder for the sector. In terms of companies, the reality is the IPO process takes, by the time you org up to get a confidential offering to flip public, that can be many months, 3+ months in the process. So the fact is the markets didn't really feel very good until maybe September. Things had gone up in the summer, but I don't think people thought it was sustainable. But I think now it feels like this is real. And so I wouldn't anticipate a huge amount of IPO activity before the end of the year, just given the fact that it takes you 4 months to sort of file, especially with a closed SEC, all of that process. I do think the first couple months of 2026 look like they could be, pretty interesting. I think the bigger question for the sector is, how many IPOs should we have, and what type of company should be going public? Because being public, as I mentioned in the sort of the 20-year blog post, it is really not for everyone. And I've been a part of companies where you sort of quickly regret being public because solving R&D questions, especially early stage R&D questions, under the glare of the public markets is not a pleasant place. Probably costs you 40 or $50 million to be public for your first 2 years when you think about bankers' fees, D&O, and all of the other issues. So if you can stay private, I'd encourage people to just stay private. But if you need to access the bigger pool of capital, I think it will likely open up in the beginning of next year.
Yeah, I want to point out that Bruce put out a terrific series with his learnings over the past 20 years in biotech investing, and we will post that here in the room. And we'll talk about some of the themes throughout the show. But I think it's a really good point. And, the other side of it, one argument for going public would be if you are public on the back of a positive milestone, it might be easier to raise additional capital and also kind of get true value for the programs that you have. But I also agree with everything you just said about how difficult it is to be a public company CEO when you're managing data readouts. It's probably one of the most stressful things that you could be doing.
And
So
Daphne, just on this point, our friend Adam Furstein did a very interesting interview with Neil Kumar of BridgeBio yesterday. That's on the podcast. And it's only 5-10 minutes, but it's worth listening to because he echoes exactly what you just said with regards to how tough it is to be a public biotech sometimes. But then you need the money to do the work that you need to do. So that's the dilemma.
yeah, and I think I remember one time when Neil had a major readout. It was, I think, his phase 3 readout, and he was talking about the Odyssey. He was putting out, some posts on there, very philosophical. But it's true; it is very stressful. It's also really fun and satisfying when you're able to get a good result.
I mean,
So, yeah,
just one additional comment on that of
sure.
trying to stay private. If you just look at the frequency of $100 million plus financings in the private market, it's like 6 or 7 a month right now. So there is actually a lot of venture activity. It may be concentrating in fewer names, but there is a lot of venture funding available for companies that want to get through that clinical inflection as a private company today.
It's a really
Bruce,
good
I feel
point.
like we've seen this movie before, though, right? And when the generals do come in, when the rising tide lifts all ships, it is very hard to hold back on IPOs.
Of course.
Generally speaking, I don't think venture guys are incentivized to do it. I don't think bankers are incentivized. I don't think we as analysts are incentivized to do it. So, do you think this is going to
Oh,
be different? Do you
I
think that there
actually
will be
think
some gates on the system?
I think everybody is incentivized to go public. It's actually the discipline to not go public. If you're the management team, when you go public, not only do you have a stock option plan, a 10b5 plan, but you lift all of the liquidation preference off your shoulders from an M&A side of things as a private company. The VCs think that they're getting a path to liquidity, so they're pushing for it. The bankers love it. I mean, 7% of every IPO, if you can just keep cashing those coupons, that's a pretty nice business. And of course, that gives you guys a lot of work on a bunch of new names. So I think everybody's incentivized to
Oh, Bruce, you're breaking up.
know it's the discipline of knowing not to do it.
And
Yeah.
who's going to exert that discipline? I mean, where is the check and balance in the system? Or we just, unfortunately, at the perils of the market again.
I mean, it is a
I think
cycle
there's
after all.
Yeah, and there's some discipline, I think, when you get to the point of price discovery, the existing investors being somewhat sensitive to dilution, so they want to go public, but then they probably also, want to offset dilution, which is another, I think, important theme that you mentioned, Bruce, in your series. This idea that how important it is that the CEO is aligned with its current with his or her current shareholders, and there is a tendency sometimes to look at the future shareholders, but that was a really, I thought, very interesting point you made there.
Yeah, no, it's a crucial one as you're weighing questions around: do I go public? Do I sell now? Do I take the kind of dilution that might be required in the public markets at low prices? All of those are real, and I'm usually the current shareholder in all those conversations rather than a new and future shareholder or future investor. And so I come at it from maybe a slightly different perspective than a new generalist might.
Yeah, and then, I think everybody would love to see an outcome like what we just saw this week with Avidity. So we started the week with exciting news that Novartis will acquire Avidity for $12 billion. Seems like everybody was happy with that deal. Let's start with Brian and then go to Eric to talk about the deal and also any implications for other companies like Dyne, for example.
Yeah, great, Daphne. Yeah, so as you said, $12 billion deal for Avidity announced this week. And this was speculated going back all the way into the summer. I mean, you look at the chart, there's a big jump in Avidity's stock price as it was rumored to be an acquisition candidate for Novartis. I mean, stocks had a tremendous run this year. And look, so Avidity, they're really a platform company with three discrete assets, and what they're really focused on is sort of delivering oligonucleotides directly to muscle. And they do have another platform that's getting spun back out that's more cardiovascular targeted. But I think the big focus and certainly all of the clinical candidates are on the muscle targeting platform. And that is what Novartis is paying for. And they sort of have two parallel lead programs, one in DMD, but a discrete subgroup of DMD patients, exon 44 amenable patients, and DM1, which is probably the bigger driver of investor focus here. And they have a plan to file the DMD program with the FDA in the very near future, and we're looking to see pivotal data from their DM1 program in 2026. And they're planning to file for that right on the back of that. And DM1's a really big indication. I cover Dyne, and these two companies are very much viewed by investors as very similar. And I would argue like the individual nuances. And Bruce, feel free to jump in to agree with me here, but I think Dyne's DM1 drugs is a little better than Avidity's, but they're a little behind Avidity too. And one of the knocks is that Avidity has this much larger phase 3 study than the Dyne study. That's more of a expansion cohort of a phase 2 study. But they'll both potentially be reviewed in somewhat parallel by the FDA. And look, I've sort of really liked the valuation discount between Avidity and Dyne, and Dyne was up almost as much as Avidity was on a percentage basis when this announcement came earlier this week. So definitely going to be an interesting area to follow as these two platforms and individual drugs move forward, and ultimately now Dyne's competing with Novartis, and we'll see if someone else winds up picking up Dyne. But I definitely think if you're Novartis, and this was a pretty seems like it was probably a competitive bid to drive up to $12 billion, one of the largest development stage deals in the history of the sector. It'll be interesting when we get the merger docs. It's really hard to look at an Avidity and not also consider a Dyne, because they are so similar both in terms of the platform and the individual programs that they have. But I'd love to hear Eric's thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe one comment, just picking up on your last valuation comment. I think this is the largest deal we've ever seen for a company that has yet to read out a phase 3 result. I mean, that's quite remarkable here, right? $12 billion for a company that is ceding all the developmental risks, the commercial risks, the clinical risks to Novartis. Now, we know Novartis loves RNA therapeutics, and Sam may want to touch on that. But this is unprecedented in that we have a company that's being valued at this level that has really yet to prove that it has a drug. Now, I've been a big fan. This has been a wonderful call for us. Daphne, to your comment, is everyone happy? Actually, I could argue that it's a mixed bag for Avidity shareholders. Sure, it's been a good run. Sure, it's a hefty premium in the mid 40s for a company that already had good performance prior to the deal. But Avidity was one of the few companies, maybe with Dyne, that really has a platform, has an opportunity to have a renewable pipeline, has an opportunity to be first and best in class in multiple very substantial markets. When you think of the biotech sector and where the next Alnylam or the next Vertex might come from, it's going to come from a company like Avidity or Dyne. So we are giving up that potential for a 20, 30, $40 billion valuation in the future when a company like Avidity chooses to sell out at this stage. Again, they're ceding a lot of risk over to Novartis, but this is one of the few, I think, that had the ability to be a renewable pipeline, a real all-star in our business.
Yeah, and it's one of the changes that we've seen, I think, in the sector that biotechs are able to launch drugs successfully, and there is that, even that the decision or the trade-off in looking at M&A at this stage of a company. So those were great points. Actually, I'd love to hear from Sam on your thoughts from a Novartis perspective on this deal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to the point of the takeout, at the end of the day, pharma companies are supposed to go and take out good companies like this. That's when the investors in the pharma side celebrate, as opposed to something which they cannot get their head around, which we will get to because there's another M&A story that we'll talk about later. So I know it's a bittersweet pill for my biotech friends, but the issue is that these are the good companies that are going to be the attractive ones with assets that make a difference to the future patent portfolio issues that some of these pharma companies have. So, as the guy said, the RNA targeting type assets, Novartis already knows quite a bit about them. It's got to deal with Alnylam, with the drug on the market, and a deal with Ionis with the drug in development, both targeting cardiovascular diseases. And it's also got a business and understands treating difficult to treat muscle diseases with spinal muscular atrophy, for instance. So this really fits very well with Novartis's knowledge base, at least, and understanding of manufacturing and getting these things underway into the market. And of course, the company needs a product or a suite of products to replace what has turned out to be not the biggest drug in the world, because currently that has apparently officially is now Zepbound or Monjaro this
Mhm.
quarter. But the Cosentyx, which is for skin diseases, autoimmune skin diseases, that's heading to about 7.8 billion revenue in 2028. And then, of course, after that, there is a risk of patent expiry. The compound patent expires in 2028, 2029. And therefore, if you look at consensus, the growth was flat from 29 onwards, or there was no growth. So this fits perfectly. It gives you a product in a sweet spot that the company understands at a time frame that is great for the Novartis. What I'd love to hear is there was somebody on Twitter saying that their technology is passé. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'd love to hear from Brian and Eric in terms of the understanding of where the tech platform is. Is it passé? Is it already become commoditized? Like a whole bunch of people out there already have these type of targeting and sense targeting drugs?
I really haven't heard that at all. I think that both Dyne and Avidity were smart and first and quick at promoting this platform. I'm sure you'll see more come on board. There are other ways to target to the muscle, but none of them are as proven as TFR antibody-mediated uptake. So, I'm sure it's on the come, but the lead time that these two companies have on the field is tremendous.
Yeah. So, and one thing that struck me about this deal and in general over the last few months is how well women CEOs have been doing on M&A this year, with some of the biggest deals being women-led companies. So, for example, so we have Sarah and Avidity, 12 billion. Sharon Mates and Intracellular, they sold that company to J&J 14.6 billion. Kate and Blueprint, 9.5 billion. Sale to Sanofi. Heather Turner, Laura Shaver, Sophie Kornowski, Jill Milne, Ivana Libish, and then of course you've got Al Nilam and Yvonne, Vertex and Reshma. So it's interesting. I actually see here Julia Owens, who is one of the Biotech CEO Sisterhood founders. There's now 400 women CEOs in the sisterhood, and I think it's good. It's good to see. So,
That's be-
yeah, go ahead.
that's better than good. That's amazing. Congrats to all the women, successful or not this year, for making it to that role.
Yeah, it's a change from what the industry looked like, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's just a real shift, and this kind of success and pattern recognition, I think, is really good for the next generation of leaders. So we had some drama this week with Novo making an unexpected bid to acquire Metsera, aiming to outbid Pfizer, who had a $7.3 billion deal in place, which included 4.9 billion upfront and 2.4 billion in milestone payments. Novo launched a surprise counteroffer of up to 9 billion, including 6.5 billion in equity and 2.5 billion in contingent value rights. One key piece of the Novo deal is that it de-risks the upfront payment for Metsera through a dividend. Metsera's board says that Novo's offer is a superior proposal and has notified Pfizer, triggering a 4-day window for Pfizer to respond or improve its bid. I haven't seen if there's anything that's happened on that, but Pfizer was not happy about this at all, calling Novo's bid reckless and unprecedented, accusing it of trying to suppress competition and violate antitrust laws. And Pfizer also claims Metsera cannot legally exit the existing agreement and is prepared to pursue legal actions. And someone also mentioned that Borla is pulling out his trump card, no pun intended, by mentioning that Novo is not domiciled in America. So, Sam, what are your thoughts on how this is likely to play out?
But congrats, Stephanie, on a brilliant trump card that you just played. No pun. No, look, the thing
Yes.
is that we all sat there as this news came out at first because there was, I think it was a Bloomberg or somebody broke it, and about not long after the actual announcement came out, and we thought, oh, that can't be true because it just doesn't make much sense, at least on paper. So you start then scratching your head thinking, how are you going to make this make sense? So let me take a whole bunch of different sides here. On the side of Metsera, I find it interesting that they say it's a superior deal because there is a real competition FTC risk here in terms of this not happening and going on for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And I don't know what kind of discount you put on that risk to apply to the sweetened bid, if you like. It's not a sweetened bid. That would be Pfizer would have to, but the deal is bigger than what Pfizer was offering. So there's that angle that I thought they can't just go, but maybe the fiduciary duty of management is to look at the actual facts and go, well, this on a numbers basis makes a lot more sense. So that's what they're doing. But if I were in their shoes, and I am not in their shoes, and these are serious senior pharma biotech people, I'm sure they've looked at everything with their advisors. Now, the 4 days for Pfizer, I suppose, expires at the end because it's 4 business days at the end of Tuesday. So let's see what Pfizer does. Certainly not enough time to get any involvement from the administration or anything like that, I suppose, unless the president decides to step in. What's interesting here also, it's Novo, right? You have that background stuff going on. I don't want to link them. I just want to remind people with regards to Greenland and Denmark, etc., in the background, right? So maybe this gives the administration sufficient reason to kind of say something. I don't know. We'll find out. But in basic numbers, the deal on the per share front is 19% better. Enterprise value is about 22% better because of the way the CVR works in the maths that we've done. But we know it's a better deal in terms of the price. The question is, can they actually get it done? There's too much overlap here. And I know Yaron wants to talk about this too. But in terms of the overlap and what is it saying about Novo, I'll say my little piece and then I'll pass it on to Yaron. But in terms of one possibility is Novo wants to scupper the deal. I don't know why would you go through all of this to make Pfizer pay 1 billion or 2 billion more? I don't see and what difference does that make to Pfizer? Then you've got the situation story here that maybe Novo actually needs it. And the story is that apparently they were one of the bidders. They just weren't high enough, or that the company assumed that there was too much risk associated with the deal because of the overlap, which of course hasn't changed. Now, Novo going in here saying we're structuring the deal in such a way that it shouldn't trigger a competition issue or an issue with the antitrust side is actually saying that there's actually an antitrust side. So we have an antitrust colleague at Bloomberg who looked at this and said, I just can't see any way that this can escape it because the FTC doesn't have to ever be actually even notified. They can just look at any deal and go to town on it, right? Go to war on it. So there's that element. After all that, so why is Novo doing it, assuming it's not any of these other things? Okay, so a lot of people said maybe it's because it's internal pipeline that's coming up, CagriSema, which is a dual chamber, at least in the first instance, GLP-1 amylin is not good enough or is going to have a tough time on the market. And they believe that the drugs out of Metsera are better. And there is data coming out of Metsera that's potentially suggests that. The next thing could be that Metsera is able to go once monthly, although we have to see some more data on that, especially on the tolerability side, which the companies may have been able to see. So is this signaling, and this is where I'm going to pass to Yaron, that Novo is lost confidence in its own up and coming drugs? If that's the case, then they've made a mistake here, frankly, because they're going to end up, if they don't get the deal, with even more questions on their pipeline and the future. Over.
Well, so let me, yeah, let me maybe pick it up. A couple of things pop into mind. I mean, first of all, we know Novo's in trouble. They've essentially vacated the entire board. The foundation essentially took over, and they've already replaced a lot of the management, which is sort of what's striking here is with a completely new board, albeit again, you clearly it is being orchestrated by the foundation behind the scenes. To get a new board to sign off on something like this, and you obviously have a brand new CEO too. This is not things that are trivial at the board level, and Bruce, chime in as well. So that to me was fairly striking, but unquestionably they're signaling that CagriSema is not going to cut it, and that's not shocking to anybody. The potency of the amylin is weaker. It's not long acting. They had some trouble with their clinical studies, the way the dosing worked and dropouts. They've lost their edge and their lead, and they're not long acting. And Metsera's pipeline, in that sense, and that's sort of what we think was also interesting for Pfizer. It's actually one company that actually has a broader tool set that Pfizer saw as attractive as a way to really get in its eyes into obesity and be relevant.
Yeah. One other thing, going back to sort of the deal structure, I was wondering if you guys could think of other deals like this where they're basically kind of preempting in some ways the regulatory approval. I was thinking of Illumina and Grail. That was one. I don't know if you have any, if anybody can think of others.
Back in the days, I'm dating myself. Boston Scientific, St. Jude, and Medtronic. Remember that? That was quite the saga.
Hmm. Okay, well, let's move to policy. Brian, can you talk about the Indiana Catalent plant news and its potential implications?
Oh yeah, sure. So I think we've talked about this a bunch, but and I don't want to overbeat a dead horse here, but this Catalent Indiana situation just seems to be the gift that keeps on giving. And it's funny that amidst all the bullishness that we're talking about in the sector, this has sort of emerged as one of the major headwinds, or certainly a question I get very, very frequently from investors across all companies: what level of exposure do my companies have to Catalent, Indiana. So this is a facility, one of the largest GMP manufacturing facilities for pharma. A lot of companies outsource to Catalent, and this was a facility that really started like ramping up production during COVID. I think there's a little bit of looking back and blaming the sort of mandates to ramp up production as maybe leading to some of the problems here. But over the last year, they've started receiving Form 483s from the FDA. 2 weeks ago, they got an official action indicated classification, which is the most severe regulatory notification that a manufacturing facility can get. And it's really kind of bled into a lot of concerns. And I think the most exposed names have very clearly been like Scholar Rock and Regeneron, both companies who have wound up receiving complete response letters just due to the Catalent, Indiana facility and the CMC issues that are going on here. It's funny, we spend so much time kind of thinking of the clinical development pathway and regulatory pathway on whether a drug is efficacious and safe. CMC kind of takes a backseat in investors' minds a lot, but it's really emerged here as a big headache to the sector. I don't remember a time where there's been such a broad impact. Maybe the Genzyme Olsen landing problems 15 years ago, but that was still pretty Genzyme specific. Here, we had a company out on the road this week that's development stage, and literally every single meeting we had and investors asked, do you have any exposure to Catalent, Indiana? So, it's certainly been an interesting thing to watch. And Regeneron reported earlier this week, and they're trying to resolve some of those issues to get some of their approvals across the board here. But companies are starting to move to other manufacturers to try to get around what's clearly a problem. And if you get a chance to look at the 483s, they're pretty grotesque. It sounds like the facilities there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially when it's juxtaposed with the, the whole tariff question and moving manufacturing. So like it sort of limits the ability to find alternatives ex-US as people think about that angle of it. Actually, I'm curious to hear from Bruce. How are your companies thinking about this? And is it something that is being actively sort of managed and worried about?
Oh, for sure. This is a huge concern. Not only that specific site, but the whole, the collapse of cell manufacturing. All of that has been front and center for boards, and I share in the upcoming year in review the data from the 270 CRLs from the summer of FDA rejection letters, and it's like 50% of them are manufacturing related. I mean, it's a really big and enormous driver of downside to not have that wrapped up properly. So very front and center for boards.
Wow, that's a huge number. All right, well, let's talk about data and conferences. So, Intellia Therapeutics and the liver tox and the impact on the field. Eric, can you take us through that?
Yeah, unfortunately, this was not a scheduled conference event. This was something out of the blue. The company announced earlier in the week that they had a second case of liver enzyme elevation, in this case, a Hy's law, associated with their their in vivo gene editing based therapy for ATTR. And yeah, this is a doozy. This is a real tough one to deal with. We don't know what caused it. Historically, we've seen some issues with the nanoparticle, the LNP, that's potentially caused liver enzyme elevations. But in this case, the time course is quite unusual. Typically, if you have LNP mediated toxicity, you see that arise quite early, and maybe by day 7 or so, it's already on the mend. These cases evolved quite late, around day 30, with no warning. And again, in the case announced this week, it was a Hy's Law case that required the trial to be paused per the company, and then subsequently for the FDA to mandate a clinical trial hold. So really tough. I mean, this company, to its credit, did the right thing. They've already treated a few hundred patients and done so fairly safely. But this is going to be a tough one to get past. There are other therapies for ATTR, and the benefit, of course, of this drug was that it was supposed to be a little bit more convenient, a one and done lifetime therapy. Obviously, that has a lot of benefit for patients if you have a clean side effect profile, but it's not going to be clear from here on out necessarily how they go about developing the drug going forward. And then, yeah, this left quite the ripple effect on the field of gene editing. I think many of their other competitors, Beam, CRISPR, Editas, Prime, were all down or are all down on the week as this field needs to deal with yet another case of sort of idiosyncratic toxicity. So not all gene edited products are created equal. Some are quite very different indeed, and I'd hope that this doesn't poison the well. But just a reminder, we need to be mindful of side effects with these newer modalities.
Yeah.
Yaron, I don't know if you want to add.
I just want to mention what was also interesting about this one, and I will go to your own afterwards for additional insights into Intellia and the broader impact. But what was interesting about this one is that the liver tox issue was disclosed on X. So there's like an X user posted that he had spoken to someone whose relative was enrolled in the clinical trial. This was like a couple days before, I think, and he put it out there that this issue was likely to be announced or that it was likely to happen. And it raises the question about an MNPI. So, like, he received some significant backlash. And of course, he wasn't under any duty of confidentiality. He learned about it from someone whose daughter was in the clinical, no, the daughter of someone who's in the clinical study. but the question of risks involved in sharing information that you learn in that manner was raised. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, and then of course, if anybody else wants to comment about Intellia or the field more generally. Yaron, did you want to comment?
I mean, the on the TTR side, I mean, Eric, maybe back to you. Do you remember? I honestly didn't look. When did the high law prevail? When did it appear? Was it really quickly, or did it come later on because of liver function?
No, it was quite a bit, about 30 or so days after infusion.
Okay. The one challenge with TTRs, there's so many amazing therapies now. Between the orals, obviously there's Donzera, which is an auto-injector from Ionis, and there's few. There's ADARRX and one more private than looking at even, I believe, Calvista also doing a Q3 and 6 months injectables. So the unmet need is fairly kind of small.
Since you're talking about Ionis and Argenx, do you want to talk about? You said something about their earnings.
Yeah, so the good news is, we are seeing an innovation cycle in biotech, and maybe we'll start with Argenx. Another very strong quarter for Vyvgart, continuing to penetrate markets globally for GMG and CIDP. It's really a superb management team, and we all take for granted sometimes commercialization, but it's really jarring to see a company perform that well and really execute that well, just given how hard it is these days to really launch drugs that well. They made some moves on their pipeline. Essentially, enrolling patients in dermatomyositis is very hard if you have an IV, and we're seeing that with the Zukibart from Pfizer. And they decided to halt enrollment in their phase 2 for their second pipeline product in DM because it just wasn't enrolling well with an IV. Roivant has an oral now that's going to be filed soon, and all the other drugs are promising sub-Q. Um, the In the meantime, they are continuing to advance Vyvgart in multiple indications. This was ACR week, so there was a lot going on in Sjogren's, and we saw the data from Novartis for the first time, the phase 3 ianalumab, which is a BAFF mechanism. And technically, both of those studies were positive, the Neptunus studies, but they sort of got through the finish line. It's like you finished a marathon and you collapse type thing. The data wasn't very compelling from an efficacy perspective. Vor, which is a public company, has a BAFF APRIL that came from Remegen in China, and they showed their phase 3s. Vor is now going to do a global study, and that data out of China was really fantastic, showing about a 3.5 point difference on the relevant scale of SDI versus about half to 1 point different from Novartis. Of course, it was out of China, so there was some difficulties extrapolating from a Chinese data set to a global data set, but they're starting a phase 3. And of course, we saw more of the FcRn data from Vyvgart from Argenx and Imavi from J&J. They're in phase 3, and their phase 2 data looks identical. And of course, Amgen's in phase 3 with their CD4 ligand antagonist for Sjogren's that's going to read out late next year. Amgen's the only company that actually has positive phase 2 data in systemic and sympathetic Sjogren's. Sjogren's is a big market. It's like we're estimating 8 to 12 billion. So that's definitely a market to watch, for sure. And then
Yeah, Eric.
Ionis had a lot of things, but let me turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think Eric also wanted to talk about CAR T data sets at ACR.
Well, yeah, we had the ACR meeting in Chicago this past week. I didn't attend, but my colleague Josh did. And from the sound of it, CAR T therapy was all the rage again. And this is a real head scratcher. There's an enormous disconnect between what we see and hear at a conference like ACR with regard to physician and even patient, possibly even big pharma enthusiasm for this class of molecules, and what investors are thinking. I mean, the players here, Cabaletta, Kyverna, maybe to a lesser degree, Bristol and Novartis have some leverage here. A few other smaller companies as well, but these companies are trading at very modest valuations with a high degree of skepticism toward what they're doing. But when you go to a conference like ACR and you see these rooms filled with listeners eagerly awaiting the latest results, it's palpable, the enthusiasm for what's going on in the field. I don't know what's going to bridge that gap in sentiment, but the data certainly continue to be extremely exciting. Scleroderma in particular has probably been the most difficult rheumatologic disease to treat. It's a disease where patients develop scar tissue throughout their body, and there's nothing that can stop the promulgation of that disease activity. And yet now, for the first time in data sets from Cabaletta and from Bristol, we're seeing some very favorable activity against this indication. So there is probably no greater unmet need in the field, and CAR Ts are packing the punch to get there. And I think, though, they come with their complexity. There's no doubt they come with their cost. We've seen businesses being made out of this in oncology, and probably just a matter of time before we see companies make a business out of this in these severe rheumatologic disorders as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we wanted to move to some kind of broader themes. This week we were talking about policy and just some of the headwinds that companies like Moderna have faced. Stat had an interesting story about Moderna. Their market value has fallen by more than 90%. It was 185 billion at its 2021 peak, and it's now hovering around 10 billion. Sam, let's talk a bit about the criticism around them overspending and overestimating sales and the rumors of a large pharma buying them out. Oh, I think we lost Sam. While we're waiting to get him back, this also struck me as relevant to some of the points from Bruce's trilogy that he put out around lean growth and boards. Yeah, Sam. So,
Oh,
did you want to go first, or should we? Yeah,
no.
why don't you go first, and then we'll hear
Okay.
from Bruce.
I mean, it's the second time X has dropped me today. So, look, the company was very focused on keeping the assets that it had, especially the COVID vaccine, all to itself. BioNTech shared with Pfizer. And so there was an enormous amount of cash that came into the coffers of Moderna over the 2, 3 years where COVID vaccine sales were significant. So what then happened, of course, is that there was what I think maybe was over enthusiasm in committing to large phase 3 trials and a whole bunch of respiratory disease vaccines and other types of infectious disease vaccines, and then of course a significant effort and focus on oncology. But a lot of it, except for the Merck one, which is a 50-50 deal, being financed by them. So that, of course, is expensive. So what has happened now is that the company's probably going to end the year this year with about $6 to $6.5 billion of cash on the balance sheet. And you said, enterprise market cap of about 10 billion. So we got an enterprise value of 3.5. And then, so what's going on here is I think that if you think about COVID vaccinations continuing to decline on an annual basis, it's possible that every year we're going to end up maybe this year at the $1.5 billion level, maybe next year at 1.2, $1.3 billion, if that trend continues. And of course, there's only so much cost cutting a company can do with the fact that it's got trials that are going on that it needs to finance, particularly the expanding deal with trial set with Merck. So what you end up with is a very rapidly dwindling cash and a risk that they would need to raise money. So here, what does a company do in these sort of circumstances? They've made all those commitments. So a stat said that somebody had approached, or there's been an approach by a pharma company that could be a takeout or a licensing deal. So we said that we think that a takeout is at the moment unlikely because of the variety of pressures that are on the top line and the bottom line. And I think the jury's still out whether an mRNA vaccine for cancer is genuinely driving a benefit from directing the immune system to the antigens that they're delivering, or is doing what a very nice Nature paper showed, a very broad, nice, innate immune activation, which you get with a COVID shot, which has been my forever criticism that there should be a control arm in here, or at least in the placebo group, of an unrelated mRNA to prove that what you're doing in these vaccines is delivered from the cancer vaccine. So all this is still uncertainty in my mind. So I'm thinking maybe the best thing that could happen here is that they actually partner out the infectious disease vaccines where there is some business, maybe go with the vaccine provider in general. So I don't know what others think. I know Yaron covers it.
Or did you want
I,
to comment?
yeah, I mean, I can be very quick. This one, I think that there was a big pharma that was anticipated to be in the mix. This one wouldn't make a lot of sense and we could be 99% wrong on this one. The underlying COVID business is under threat. Merck has their own sort of BD priorities. We just don't. Again, we don't want to speak for them. We don't think this is going to be one of them. They do have access to the vaccine, and for another pharma to acquire Moderna to get access to technology that's still fairly risky and expensive to maintain, I think is going to be fairly tough. We're skeptical.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because it was such a strong execution play in terms of like getting a drug to market, launching it commercially worldwide, and such a success story on one side of it, and then now it looks pretty dire. But I mean, I think Stefan is somebody that people have been skeptical about in the past, and he's pulled things out that have surprised folks. So, would love to hear from you, Bruce. You talked a lot about management, boards, scaling, all of that in your trilogy. Do you want to cover? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to Moderna, I would just say it's very easy now to sit in the cheap seats of, the Monday morning, and I can make comments as to, they had an AOL Time Warner moment where they had a bigger market cap than Merck and should have used their inflated equity to buy, you know, what you might describe as a real or a mainstream business and diversified off of, a pretty risky mRNA platform that certainly was instrumental in saving the world from COVID, but doesn't seem to have lots of hits beyond that. So it's easy to say, they should have taken advantage of it. I think the lesson is when you have a stock price that the board and management team think is, let's just say exuberantly valued, you should take advantage of it. I mean, Lilly at some, valuation multiples, you could say that they should be much more aggressive about deploying when their price to earnings is where it is relative to a BMS, which sort of brings me to the point of, as all of these wonderful tailwinds happen in our space, when are we going to have you know the resurgence of big to big mergers? My prediction is that we will see that in the next 3+ months. You're going to see large companies in the mid to high double digit billions being bought or merged with the much larger. I mean, it's amazing the spread between big pharma from 40 billion to 800 billion today. So it'll be interesting to see whether some of those companies leverage their let's just say exuberantly priced equity to buy some other companies.
Yeah, we got to write this down and remember it. Come back to it if and when it happens. So any other comments? Then maybe we can dig deeper into your trilogy and some of the themes in there. I thought they were very relevant, and we don't often get a chance on this show to zoom out. So I think spending the last 10 minutes sort of zooming out, talking about lessons, and I think that would be very interesting. So let's pause for a second, see if anybody else wants to comment, and then I'll go back to you, Bruce.
Just on that M&A thing that Bruce said, very, very quickly, I think somebody like Lilly, the decision that they need to make is how sustainable is their top line in the numbers that we're seeing. This quarter, $10 billion for the GLP-1. If that's sustainable, I think that supports an enormous amount of internal R&D to the point that they don't need to do what Moderna should have done when its market cap was 80, 100 billion, 140 billion. I can't remember how high they went, to have bought some companies. And of course, as Bruce said, I'm definitely one of the reside commentators here because I'm not even as close as Bruce is to the market in general. So, but at the end of the day, I think large pharma is doing it. We've just been talking about this. Novartis is doing it. They're not necessarily using their shares; they're using their cheap cash. So it's harder, I think, for the biotechs. But even there, we've seen some. So with Genmab and oh gosh, I forget who they took out.
Maris.
That's right. Sorry. So So it's happening. Over.
Bruce, did you want to comment on any of the themes from your trilogy?
I mean, I would just say it was super fun to reflect on 20 years at the same firm doing the same thing, and some of the lessons learned on it. On the people front, one of the things that I come back to is the power of luck in our business. No one wants to admit it, but it's a super important part of what we do. The stochastic nature of the science that we do. Getting successful exits. The overlap in Venn diagrams between talent. Getting to a successful scientific result, a new medicine and successful exit, that's a pretty hard thing to get the triple bullseye on. Much more often, there's a piece of luck around any one of those. And so leads you to the conclusion of staying humble, but also that the celebrity worship that we have in our space, and certainly in the tech space around certain founders, there's a lot of celebrity worship too. I think it raises some questions around that. And there are a lot of really exceptional leaders in our field who've rolled the dice a couple times, and it takes 6 to 8 years to report out on whether the science works. And when they don't work, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not, exceptionally good leaders and CEOs. And we just have to, be mindful of that particular point. That was one that I got a lot of personal feedback on as well. But over time, not overvaluing the celebrities and focusing on substance is super important.
Yeah, I think that a few of the themes that stood out to me is one of them was around CEOs being good at resource allocation and managing the burn, the timelines. And I think your point was that the board needs to really understand burn, weigh the trade-offs, and allocate costs accurately. I would also point out that if the CEO is doing their job well, they're doing that very proactively. So once the board has to take, an active role in there, that's usually a sign that something's not right. And your other point, I think that was pretty interesting, was that the signals that you likely need a CEO change are visible far before you make the decision. And you had mentioned a few of those signals. What are the ones that you think really stand out in terms of red flags and on the CEO side?
Yeah, I mean, the CEO point is again one you always know in the rearview mirror of like, darn, I should have done that earlier. But you frequently convince yourself not to. You're in the midst of a financing, don't want to change while we're financing, or you're in the midst of a BD discussion and you think it might scare the pharma company away. And so you sort of convince yourself to stick around. And sometimes that works, but most often, you know, both if you're recognizing it, then the team probably recognizes it as well, that the CEO might not be um, excelling at what they're doing, or maybe floundering, and you know frankly a lot of the times they're overstressed about, they recognize they're underperforming, and so that just leads to even more challenges. So I think that the signals around storytelling, fundraising, traction on the BD, I comment about the two different flavors of CEOs, that some are openers and some are closers. Very rarely do you have somebody who's great at both of those two things. It does happen on rare occasions, but more typically, you need to put a CBO who's a closer next to a CEO who's not. And those kinds of complementary team dynamics you start to think about a lot more. But those are a lot of the signals that you see in boardrooms and you see in traction of like, hey, how come the B round was really hard, the C round was hard, and now we're struggling to get a deal done? That might actually be a real signal there.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from the analysts on here. To what extent do the analyst and investor community pick up on those signals earlier and wonder about that versus, kind of being surprised when there's a change in management?
I mean, I'd say in my case, maybe it's mixed, and at times, a lot of times it's obvious way ahead of time. I would say when you know it's going to happen, it usually happens fairly late, and the company would have been better served, as Bruce said, to do it much earlier. Which begs the question. I think we've talked about it many times. Do most boards really have a good pulse as to what's going on, and do they really have the right discussions or not?
Yeah, this whole concept of boards and how boards and management are thinking about shareholders. I think that in our field, the boards do a really good job thinking about the company, the culture, things like that, and of course patience. I think that's always front and center, but sometimes don't necessarily have the shareholder hat on as much as they probably should. I liked your
Yeah,
other
no,
point.
I
Go ahead. Go
agree.
ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say I agree with that entirely. There's so many topics on a board. You could have a whole call on it of, boards not wanting to rock the boat. That just is super common. A lot of the times, boards, especially as they become public boards, have more independence on them, and they all, are effectively serving at the discretion of the CEO. And so everybody is super supportive and cheerleading, and you're supporting the team. And of course, you have tough conversations about certain things, but generally speaking, no one wants to rock the boat around being tough on compensation discussions, being tough on objectives, performance, digging into the details of cash burn. How many CFOs have said, like, wow, this is uncomfortable. You know, they're micromanaging me, or they're down in the weeds of this particular discussion of resource allocation. Boards need to do that. I think, you'd much rather err on the side of a board that knows too much about the inner workings of a business than too little. Um, but a lot of times you lose, especially as they become public, you lose large owner director roles. And I think that's a huge problem in small cap public biotechs, where there really aren't any large owners in a bunch of those companies boardrooms. And that leads to a view of a less of a discussion about things like dilution and appropriate resource allocation and such. That's why I love seeing the big public investors, the Bakers, the BVFs, the Perceptives, the Aboros, actually playing real roles in the boards of companies they have a lot of conviction around. I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I also think that this concept of truth-seeking leadership is really important because if you take that approach from the beginning and you get the board comfortable with the fact that you're going to share everything, the problems, the different scenarios, and all of that, you end up getting a lot more support and a lot less micromanaging if you're being proactive around those things. So, but
Totally.
yeah,
In particular, that truth seeking is really important. I mean, it's always important in a company, but I find it super important, in those early years, discovery through early clinical, when you're getting data that doesn't look like what you thought it would look like. You have one type of leader who is truth seeking around, says, this isn't what we thought. We have a gate around this. There's a no-go question. We're going to answer it. And if it's not right, we're either going to shut the program or shut the company down, and you move on, because time from a really great executive is more scarce than capital, frankly. um, you often see what happens is the data comes and then the hand waving starts, and the hand waving moves really really fast, trying to explain, oh, we kind of expected this to happen, this is what we thought might happen, except the board and the rest of the team, we never heard that that was what we thought would happen, of course.
right.
And so you get into all of this hand waving that sort of tries to explain away the morphing of the hypothesis that you're going after. And you know that's where truth seeking really helps align everyone around. Let's face it, in science, especially in the translation of academic work, a lot of this isn't going to play through the way we hope it will.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really important in advance to say what you think success will look like. So sort of set a bar for success, set a bar for sort of this is not what we'd like to see, but it's gray. And then agree in advance, like this is bad. We wouldn't want to see this. And then you plan in advance for those different outcomes. Okay, well, listen, this is such an interesting series. I recommend that everybody read it, and we'll have you back on when you talk about your year in review. So,
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for a great discussion. I just want to close by mentioning that some of you may have seen on our social media channels that in partnership with Biotech TV, we're hosting our annual in-person networking event at JP Morgan. I know, Bruce, you will not be there, but a lot of other people will be. It used to be called the Tweet Up, but I think we still call it the Tweet Up, the X Up, whatever. It's going to be at Persona on Tuesday, January 13th from 7 to 10 p.m. We are talking to a number of different co-sponsors. We're going to be making final sort of sponsorship decisions this week, in the next week or so. But if you are interested in sponsoring and have not yet reached out, please reach out to team@biotechhangout.com. And we look forward to seeing everyone there. It's completely open, and the sponsors pay for the drinks. So that's a nice thing. Uh, Great conversation, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you soon on Biotech Hangout.
Happy Halloween.